Shufu only smiled faintly and extended a hand. One finger rose and stopped Homelander dead in his tracks. Homelander's power was terrifying enough to shatter mountains with a single blow, but Shufu's finger halted it as if it were nothing. After blocking him so effortlessly, Shufu spoke slowly, almost lazily. "You call yourself a superhero when you don't even have the strength to land a hit? You're not even as good as a beggar on the street." He pushed with that single finger, then flicked it forward. Homelander felt a searing pain shoot through his fist and up his arm. He staggered back, clutching his arm and sucking in a cold breath. For appearance's sake, Homelander forced a grin, clenching his jaw and putting his hand behind his back as if nothing was wrong, but everyone could see he was bluffing. Nearby, Magneto and Charles, recuperating close to Shufu, had noticed immediately that something was off. Magneto's eyes brightened and he shouted, elation breaking through his composure. "Good. Well done." Tears shimmered at the corners of his eyes. He'd finally seen a real chance to topple Homelander. Shufu's strength had only grown. He just felt Homelander's raw power, the kind that could tear through the toughest metal in the world, and yet it had been little more than a child's tantrum against Shufu. Magneto couldn't hide his excitement. Not everyone watching shared that sentiment. Nick Fury stood with a wary expression. There was a new, lingering fear in his eyes. He'd considered making Shufu a target once. Thankfully, he hadn't. This man was far more dangerous than anyone had guessed. Even the Ancient One and Odin, two of the world's greatest, watched with recognition. Shufu's power was beyond ordinary, worthy of their notice. Shufu didn't care how many were watching. He'd only given the fight a small portion of his strength, no need to use his full arsenal. He had a plan. Homelander had been designed in the image of Superman. Vought's whole purpose with Compound Vive had been to make superhumans. Shufu intended to use the template's own moves against him and to strike where it would hurt most. A small, cold smile curved Shufu's mouth. In Homelander's ears, it sounded like a guillotine's whisper. "What's the matter? Scared to come closer? Weren't you supposed to be invincible? Turns out Vought's golden boy is just a loudmouth clown." Those words struck deeper than any blow. Homelander's public image, everything he'd built his identity around, flickered under that taunt. He had endured so much for that facade. Shufu had found the weak point. "You die here," Homelander snarled through clenched teeth and launched himself like a missile. He used the classic Superman tactic: rush in, wrap his arms around his opponent, and pin them to the ground. It worked against weaker opponents, but the move was more about theater than true force against someone stronger. When Homelander slammed into Shufu, the difference between them became brutally clear. The impact that would have crushed adversaries barely registered. Shufu stood like an ancient reef in a storm, unmoved by wind or wave. "Homelander," Shufu said, almost gently, "have you been watching too many movies? Do you really think that old trick will help you?" Without fuss, he swung an elbow into Homelander. Elbow strikes were deceptively devastating, and this one landed with a sickening crack. The sound of bone splintering echoed as visible ripples radiated outward from the point of impact. Homelander's grip loosened. Shufu didn't hesitate. He brought his elbow down again, forcing Homelander's arms apart. Then he stepped back and delivered a whip-like kick that sent Homelander hurtling like a meteor toward the trees. The forest beside them exploded into motion. A cloud of dust and splinters rose as thousands of trees were sheared down. Within a radius that stretched nearly a kilometer, trunks snapped and canopies collapsed, leaving nothing but a field of broken timber and scattered debris where the forest had been. The ground was a ruin, a single huge pit with countless fissures radiating outward, each crack a meter or two wide like a network of ravines. Homelander lay at the center of that pit, his face battered, his armor torn. He looked like Loki after one too many hits from the Hulk. This, Shufu told himself, was still with him holding back. If that strike had landed on Homelander's neck, he would have been crippled, even if not dead. Homelander had lived by raw power for so long, he'd never learned to fight. He didn't know the vulnerabilities of the human body. He'd grown used to the fact that ordinary humans posed no real threat. He'd forgotten that people had minds as well as muscles. Shufu, however, was not ordinary. Shufu dropped silently from the sky and stood looking down at Homelander. You're just a mindless test subject, he said, voice calm. You rely only on the strength of your body, and you don't understand that the most dangerous thing about humans is their intelligence. Red energy crawled under Homelander's skin, knitting wounds shut, and his eyes burned with a mix of grief and disbelief. Shufu's words were precise and cold, like knives aimed at the heart. Hearing them, Homelander felt unease, pain, confusion, emotions colliding until his composure began to crack. Shufu watched that slippage with a quiet smile. It was the kind of attack on the soul that a Joker would make, finding the soft spots and pressing. But it wasn't only psychology. At root, Shufu still drew on the power from Superman's body. Only with that strength behind him could his words carry teeth. Intellect and power worked together, amplifying one another into something far beyond ordinary mockery. Under that pressure, Homelander began to lose his cool. His wounds sealed completely. He pushed off the ground with a thunderous slap and shot into the air. Dust caked his face, his once glorious armor hung in tatters, and with that grim expression he looked monstrous. Die! He snarled. Red beams lashed from Homelander's eyes toward Shufu. Shufu's form blurred, not because he'd become translucent, but because his speed threw off a huge afterimage, an illusion of movement. Homelander's lasers couldn't track him, and the failure to connect made the enraged man more ferocious. Can you only hide? He roared. He lashed out again. Wherever Homelander aimed, the ground was ripped apart, turning into a scorched field of molten rock. The force of his power was less human than divine. Shufu, however, walked through the devastation as if strolled across a garden path, composed, almost amused, as if it were a game rather than a battle. It isn't that I can only hide, Shufu said, stopping in front of him. It's that your power is too crude to threaten me. The remark opened a raw wound in Homelander. Two concentrated beams of red fired from his eyes, energy capable of melting metal and slicing through the most formidable materials. The rays combined searing heat with blunt impact. They were perfect killing tools, perfected to rend flesh and steel alike. Homelander expected that attack to end the fight. Shufu didn't flinch. He stood there and let the beams strike him. Homelander's expression turned cruel, already picturing Shufu torn apart and begging. But to his stunned disbelief, Shufu stood unbroken. The blast seared his clothes to tatters, leaving his upper body exposed, but the laser had no devastating effect. His skin flared a little red, but there was no rip, no charring, no incision. How is that possible? Homelander barked. Why don't you feel anything? Shufu glanced at him, mildly amused. Because you're weak, he said. Too weak. Homelander's shock became rage. I don't believe you, he screamed, and poured everything into one final discharge. He concentrated every reserve into his eyes, driving the beams to maximum output. The light went from fierce red to blinding, and a pressure built behind his eye sockets, so intense they burned. This will kill you, he thought, throwing the full weight of his power forward. The doubled, incandescent beam slammed into Shufu's chest. The laws of the physical world did not bend to anyone's will. Homelander was learning that the hard way. The red thermal beam struck Shufu directly and left him utterly unharmed. The surrounding trees and earth were another story. The trees blackened and collapsed. The ground melted as if the gates of hell had opened. You see, Shufu said, smiling, and pointed to the cooling, scorched earth beside him. Your power isn't as absolute as you think. Homelander felt a strange, gnawing doubt. If it hadn't been for the terrifying melt marks all around, he might have convinced himself his power had simply failed. But it hadn't. Why wasn't Shufu affected at all? Even Homelander, with his own durability, would have been wounded by an attack like that. He had no answer. The certainty of decades of experience suddenly felt shaky. You're doubting yourself? Shufu said. I'll help you solve that doubt. I'll show you what real power is. He leaned forward. Orange-red light flared in his eyes. Superman's heat vision and Homelander's beams might look similar on the surface, but they were fundamentally different. Superman's was solar, a scorching thermal ray that melted through matter, a manifestation of the sun's overwhelming energy. Homelander's was more like a high-frequency laser, an oscillating energy beam optimized for cutting. Its thermal damage was almost incidental. When Shufu raised his own heat vision, though, those distinctions melted away. The intensity of his power was far beyond anything earlier. The beam that erupted from his eyes was more like a spurting column of molten plasma, a volcanic blast, not just light. Homelander barely had time to react. He blinked and tried to dodge, but Shufu's gaze tracked him like a shadow. The orange-red torrent swept across the ground, and the earth fractured and liquefied under its onslaught. Soil became lava in an instant. Gullies opened where there had been solid ground. Trees didn't just burn, they evaporated before they could even char. Metal turned liquid and pooled with the molten soil. Homelander trembled at the sight. He knew, beyond doubt, that a full strike like that would cripple him. What Shufu emitted was not merely light, it was high-temperature plasma, erupting and fusing continuously, hotter than any beam Homelander could produce. He didn't dare hold his ground. After several passes, the mountain had become a sea of lava. Shufu hovered over it, a living cannon, repeatedly unleashed. His posture, the calm casualness of an attacker who toyed with prey, was chilling. Everyone watching fell silent. Magneto was mute. He could wreck a city by bending metal, but manipulating metal was fundamentally different from what Shufu was doing. Magneto's power left patterns and signatures. It was manipulation and control. Shufu's destruction transcended that. It was pure annihilation, an elemental force apparently born to erase. Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. frowned. He ran through tactical contingencies and found them all lacking. Even if the Avengers threw everything they had at Shufu, S.H.I.E.L.D. had no feasible way to subdue him. One person's firepower, Fury thought, seemed comparable to the combined detonation of many nuclear warheads. Erasing a city would be easy. This mountain had been turned into a lava sea in minutes. Fury felt a cold certainty. This was a threat beyond their standard playbook. The Ancient One watched through mystic sight and sighed. Shufu's strength exceeded all expectations. His power had already pushed past the normal limits of mortals. If he took another step, he might touch a higher plane, become something like a human god. He could even conceivably defend a civilization numbering in the hundreds of millions. The Ancient One's mind flashed to legends of the Great Inferno, a force that once erupted from hell and reduced whole lands to molten wasteland. Shufu's power carried the same terrible quality. For one so young, the potential was staggering. If someone in Kamar-Taj possessed such a level, the Ancient One thought ruefully, he would have cause to burn incense in gratitude. Instead, he could only feel a mix of awe and melancholy at what existence had produced. Far beyond Earth, Odin felt similar stirrings. Lifetimes of experience had shown him countless extraordinary beings across the cosmos, but Shufu's intensity was rare, even by those standards. For a moment, Odin's thoughts turned to his son. If Thor possessed half of this boy's natural aptitude, he would be less of a worry. The comparison left him uncomfortably aware of his son's limitations. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Shufu kept attacking. The molten fury pouring from his gaze erased anything near him, and the assembled heroes and strategists could only watch, stunned and very aware that face-to-face confrontation might be impossible. The true scale of his power had finally become undeniable. Between them, there wasn't just a gap in power, there was a gap in perception and understanding. Even the Skyfather-level powerhouses watching nearby breathed in awe. And then there was the Earthling, Shufu. His performance could no longer be described as merely human. He had surpassed humanity. Calling him the god of the human world wasn't an exaggeration. Magneto, seeing Shufu through the shared perspective of the mutant at his side, felt a surge of joy. Fortunately, Shufu was a mutant. Fortunately, he was on their side. Otherwise, none of them would have known how to face this kind of enemy. Shufu moved like a god descending into their world. Just looking at him inspired dread. The title fit. In comparison, even Superman, in the Silver Age at his height, had been a creature of imagination made flesh, power beyond mortal comprehension. Homelander, by contrast, was lacking. Even if he'd been strengthened for the Marvel Universe, he was no match for Shufu. It showed on his face, fear. Homelander had never been a true strategist. A true powerhouse finds ways to meet threats. Homelander looks for escapes. Facing Shufu, panic had already crept in. He couldn't afford to die here. He stabilized just long enough to spit out an insult. "You mutant trash. I'm not in the mood today. I'll come back another time." Then he shot into the sky, fleeing in disgrace. Watching him go, he looked like he wished he had another pair of wings. Go if you want. Leave if you want. Dream on, Shufu sneered. His body blurred, then appeared above Homelander's head. Get down here, he said, and punched. Homelander shot downward, faster than before. Violent air carved into the ground. Shufu didn't let him go. He flashed again beneath Homelander and raised his leg, kicking. Homelander became a ball, sent flying. He tried to use flight to stop himself, but his energy couldn't absorb the sheer kinetic force Shufu delivered. He tumbled uncontrollably back into the sky. Shufu treated him like a toy. His outline seemed to duplicate in midair. Afterimages from his impossible speed, and Homelander was the pathetic center, being battered like a plaything. Bang after bang, Homelander learned what it was to be on the receiving end. Before long, his nose was broken, his face swollen, bruises covering his body. Homelander's physiology was impressive, but Shufu's power was terrifying. The result was inevitable. Homelander's features were a ruin. Where he'd once been considered handsome among humans, now his face was puffed, his eyes narrowed to slits. There was nothing left of the invincible posture he'd just worn. Homelander, Shufu said lightly, you're not as strong as you say. In the end, you're just Vought's experiment, he went on. You'd do well to remember you were made by someone. Those words struck Homelander like a thunderbolt. He had long suspected parts of his origin. Vought had hidden a lot, but with his access he'd learned fragments. What he refused to do was accept it. Shufu's words cut clean through his denial. Anger rose inside him, the same raw, volcanic fury he'd felt the night he was betrayed and killed her with his own hands. The anger of the weak looks pathetic to the strong, but Homelander, by every strict measure, wasn't merely weak. He had mutant genes in him. When mutant power erupts, it could be terrifying. Scarlet Witch gone dark had once slaughtered the entire Illuminati and nearly annihilated the Avengers. When her power flared, even Thanos had seemed small by comparison. Homelander's potential might not equal hers, but when it broke loose, it was still fearsome. Enough, he roared, face contorting. A crimson light ignited in his chest. Red energy flared outward, and a web of red veins crept under his skin, glowing as though something fierce had been lit inside him. Chapter 125, Section 125. Under those conditions, his injuries began to knit themselves. He was whole again in an instant. Shufu hovered in the sky with his arms folded, watching Homelander with absolute calm. He had no intention of intervening. Homelander tilted his head up toward him, his eyes full of hatred. I'll make you regret saying that. The sentence came out more like a snarl than words. Shufu only smiled faintly. Is that so? You can try. Shufu's smile never reached his eyes. To him, Homelander was a joke, like Superman meeting Steppenwolf, and that complete disdain cut deeper than any blow. For someone arrogant like Homelander, nothing hurt more than being dismissed. Ah! Homelander let loose an animal roar. His chest flared brilliantly, and then a torrent of red energy burst outward, reckless and uncontrolled. The crimson wave was visible for tens of thousands of kilometers. It shredded the clouds and sent vapor streaming into the sky. The light sliced through the atmosphere like a jagged blade and shot into space. Homelander had become a living laser, squandering power without restraint. Shufu, however, showed no reaction. The ordinary clothes around him evaporated instantly, but his black battlesuit held firm. The red energy, capable of melting anything it touched, had no effect when it struck him. He floated in the air, expression untroubled, a faint smile on his lips. This is impossible, Homelander bellowed. He refused to believe that an attack he had pushed beyond his limits would fail to break Shufu's defense. He clenched his teeth and poured more energy into his chest. A second, even more terrifying torrent spewed forth. The beam widened and its intensity doubled. Still, it did nothing to Shufu. Shufu simply stood in the raging stream, reached out and patted his own chest as if feeling the breeze. Then he walked forward, step by deliberate step. Homelander's eyes widened. He pushed harder, squeezing every last bit of energy from every cell, making the crimson flood more ferocious, but Shufu continued toward him as if the blast were nothing at all. Fear crept into Homelander's face. His body trembled, and the violent outpouring of energy gradually faded. You are a monster, he stammered. Shufu had already closed the distance. He reached out and grabbed Homelander by the throat. Monster? Shufu repeated. No, I'm not a monster, Homelander spat, his voice shaking. I am Homelander. I can't die. Those who abandon their humanity for power are monsters, Shufu said quietly. Like you. With a hoarse, desperate roar, Homelander erupted into light, his entire form turning into a burning crimson sphere. Energy cascaded off him so brightly it was like a second sun, blotting out the daylight. Whole cities would have been helpless under such a surge. Yet it left Shufu untouched, his hair unruffled, his calm intact. Shufu's eyes went amber. The mental energy in his mind synchronized with the raw power in his body. For someone at Homelander's level, conventional wounds were meaningless. Suffocation and ordinary injuries wouldn't kill him. Shufu chose a simpler, more direct approach. He would physically outmatch him, crush his bones, scatter him to dust. Power coalesced in Shufu's hand, a terrifying force that snapped Homelander's neck like a twig. The cervical spine twisted and broke. Still, Homelander did not fall. The injuries seemed to have no lasting effect. Shufu had not intended to kill outright, only to stop him from resisting. He tossed Homelander aside with a single motion, took a steadying breath, then drew his fist back to his waist and punched forward. An inconceivable force exploded from his fist. A violent shockwave radiated outward, centered on Shufu, sweeping across the landscape. Visible white trails tore across the sky. Distant peaks evaporated under the blast of power. From orbit, Shufu's punch would have looked like a gouge tens of thousands of kilometers long across the surface. The clouds above split open. Homelander, his intended target, stood frozen and silent. Still not as good as Teacher Saitama, Shufu said with a dissatisfied shake of his head. He turned and walked away, step by deliberate step. Behind him, Homelander began to crumble. It was as if someone had snapped their fingers and reduced him to sand, each part of him disintegrating, blowing away grain by grain. The restraints that had once held him were long gone. Whoever had brought them had fled. The crowd that witnessed it was mute. Shufu's power no longer looked human. Those who had not seen it could not fathom how terrifying it was. Even Nick Fury, watching through satellites, sat in stunned silence. He had watched Captain Marvel and had thought nothing on Earth could surprise him. He had been wrong. Shufu's single punch shattered decades of Fury's certainty. The idea that humans, through effort and technology, could defend the planet against any threat suddenly felt naive. What was this, if not a force beyond ordinary human comprehension? Fury, the fighter who had never known defeat, felt a rare, cold despair. He sat in the dark for more than 10 minutes, then refocused. If this was the new reality, they needed a new strategy. We should try to befriend him, Fury decided. He's human, there's something to work with, and Stark needs to speed up his work. Fury had already funneled resources to Tony Stark and Bruce Banner to create a power capable of defending humanity. It was no longer enough. They needed more knowledge, possibly beyond Earth's. If Shufu could stop and kill Homelander, what if in future someone like Homelander arose from him? Better to cultivate an ally now than face an unknown threat later. Those hiding in the shadows felt a different panic. Who could have guessed Shufu was this strong? Nuclear strikes had failed to touch him. What if he came looking for them? Many whispered and despaired, but others reacted with calm or with different measures. The Ancient One watched, composed. Shufu was powerful, certainly, but not at the Skyfather level. Skyfathers were beings who had transcended humanity completely, entities who could treat Earth the way Dormammu treated a snack. The Ancient One could, if she wished, obliterate the planet. That was the scale of difference. Shufu, for all his terrifying talent, was still a child in comparison. That was the true shock. At his age, to possess such raw combat power was staggering. The Ancient One had spent centuries learning, enduring countless trials to reach her stature. Shufu fished and lived like a boy, yet his potential was enormous. If he matured, who knew what heights he could reach? She made a quiet decision. She would find a way to make contact in the future. The boy's nature seemed promising. Far away in Asgard, Odin watched the scene through his own magic and felt much the same stirrings. The raw, arrogant power reminded him of his youth. Shufu could be called godlike. An age of conquest might lie ahead for him, just as it once lay ahead for Odin. Now old and wearied, Odin felt a twinge of belatedness at the sight of such a beginning. He discarded any impulse of envy. If managed well, Shufu could be an asset to Thor. In a crisis, the boy might become the life-saving ally a son would need. Odin resolved to observe Shufu carefully. If the boy proved trustworthy, allowing Thor to associate with him could be advantageous. Lightning flashed in Odin's eyes. No boast, only calculation and a sense of the boy's limitless possibilities. Word of the event spread swiftly. Everyone who could watch had formed an opinion: awe, fear, hope, worry. Shufu's name shot into public conversation overnight. Chapter 127, Section 127. Chapter 77, The Curtain Falls. Reckoning after the autumn, seeking subscriptions. The storms and stresses of the outside world meant nothing to Shufu. That had always been his style. He didn't care about what others thought. The problem was that after dealing with Homelander, there was still more to settle. Homelander himself posed no lasting threat, but Vought Corporation behind him was another matter. Who knew what schemes they were cooking up to handle him? This was the Marvel Universe. Mad scientists and dangerous ideologies weren't just a possibility, they were a certainty. Even someone like the Golden Age Superman could stumble here if he wasn't careful. Above them all sat the one above all. Below that, beings like the Living Tribunal and other godlike entities made the political landscape extraordinarily perilous. Shufu had to be cautious. If he wanted to be safe, he needed to neutralize the people who could turn on him. But that was troublesome. It wasn't worth his time to go after them personally, and any overt action would only make things worse. The power structure in this universe didn't follow the rational rules of his old world. People at the top nursed ambitions and delusions. They could be irrational enough to join Hydra or try to seize global power. Power breeds paranoia. Politicians here saw every powerful individual as a threat. Nick Fury was a case in point. Vought's brutality toward mutants suggested they had even more dangerous backers ready to pull strings from the shadows. Shufu could squash them if he wanted, but the fallout might be catastrophic. What if they retaliated with nuclear force? There were indeed maniacs in this universe who would do exactly that to Manhattan. He didn't fear a bomb for himself so much as the loss of this whole fishing pond he'd been cultivating. Everything he'd built could disappear. That thought was infuriating. Violence, Shufu decided, would be a last resort. Fortunately, the Joker's neural net was about to prove invaluable. The Joker wasn't just a high IQ wildcard from the DC side. His true danger lay in his uncanny talent for manipulating people's hearts and minds. The Joker could warp the sane into lunatics. Even Batman had been twisted by him. Using that capability in battle would be wasteful. The real utility was psychological. Twist, corrupt, and undermine the schemers from within. Let them see real terror. Investigation into Vought's true controllers would be tedious. Shufu was too lazy to go digging himself. He had a better plan. He returned to the beach and contacted Magneto, arranging to use the mutant leader's resources and hatred for Vought. If anyone would want to devour Vought whole, it would be Magneto. Shufu only needed to hand over some information and let Magneto do the rest. He didn't have to wait long. Magneto arrived, escorting Charles Xavier. When the two of them came into view, their expressions were strange, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, as if they were looking at a rare specimen. "Professor, why are you staring like that?" Shufu asked with a small smile. "It's nothing," Charles replied, shaking his head. "I'm just surprised. At your age, to achieve what you have and remain so calm, that's not easy." Charles's voice carried more than politeness. He was thinking of his own younger days, how he'd once been reckless, intruding into minds, indulging in drink and women. If he'd had Shufu's power back then, he might have been flamboyant, not low-key. Shufu's composed demeanor didn't fit his years. Shufu smiled and said simply, "I'm just doing what I like. Achieving power isn't the same as wanting it. There's nothing remarkable about that." Charles nodded, as if that explained everything. Magneto, however, seemed at a loss. After years leading mutants, he didn't know how to act in front of someone like Shufu. He struggled for the right words before speaking earnestly. "Shufu," Magneto said, "you've done more for the mutant cause than I can measure. Charles and I both believe you should become the leader of the mutants. With you at the helm, our people would have a brighter future." Shufu's expression hardened. Reward? Responsibility? He bristled at the thought. He was content as he was, a fisherman, enjoying a quiet life, and had no desire to shoulder the burdens and restrictions that came with leading a massive movement. No way. He would let them handle the politics and the battles. Once the dust settled, he'd go back to his own pursuits. I appreciate it, Shufu said lightly, but I'm not interested in being anyone's leader. I prefer to do what I want, leave the ruling and the sacrifice to those who want it. Magneto's face fell, the disappointment unmistakable. Charles looked on with a gentle, almost resigned expression. They had hoped to recruit a once-in-a-generation force. Instead, Shufu wanted peace. Shufu turned the conversation instead to the task at hand. He outlined the intelligence he'd gathered about Vought and the people likely backing them, and explained how the Joker neural net could be used to undermine those hidden hands. He could hand over the threads and watch powerful men and women unravel themselves from within. Less violence, more chaos inside the enemy camp. That suited him fine. Magneto's eyes lit at the plan, while Charles listened, thoughtful. They were pragmatic. If Shufu didn't want the crown, they could still use his tools. The three of them began to coordinate. The real struggle, perhaps, would be the quiet one, turning ambition into fear, loyalty into doubt, so the enemies would eliminate themselves without a single nuclear mushroom cloud. Shufu liked the sound of that. He'd make them see true terror, but on their terms. Then he'd go fishing. Section 128, Shufu refused flatly. You have no interest in becoming a leader, Charles said, trying to hide his embarrassment. A meaningless responsibility, Eric added. Instead of thinking about the future, you spend every day fighting your own people. Their expressions were sheepish, as if Shufu were lecturing them both. He merely shook his head. I'm not here for that. Magneto and Charles blinked. Magneto's face, after a moment of wounded pride, hardened into curiosity. Then what did you call us here for? I couldn't think of a better way to reward you, Shufu said coolly. The mutant nation no longer has anything better to give. Magneto couldn't help but sigh. A look of pity crossed his features as he thought of the toll the last weeks had taken. Homelander had seemed untouchable to ordinary mutants, a god among them, and in those days, tens of thousands had died at his hands. For a sparsely populated race, that loss was staggering. The number wounded was even greater, and the resources needed to care for them would set the nation back for a long time. Whatever could be offered to Shufu now would feel small by comparison. Shufu shook his head again. I'm not asking for charity. I'm not that petty. He put it plainly. He wasn't here to beg for help. If he needed allies, he'd wait until they had strength to spare. Mutants were still a promising people. Even Eric had not reached his full potential. If that potential could be developed, they could be the strongest force on Earth, a power that could help him face threats beyond even his own improvements. Thanos and his forces loomed in the cosmic dark, and Shufu knew he would need help against such armies. What I brought you here for is information, he said. Eric, now that Homelander is dead, are you satisfied? Of course not, Magneto snapped. You should know the real culprit behind all of this hasn't disappeared. Vought Corporation, Eric said, clenching his teeth. Homelander had been brutal, but Vought was worse, capturing and experimenting on people, manipulating events from the shadows. Homelander had been their puppet. I haven't forgotten, he said. I'll settle the score with them. Shufu's expression turned grave. Why wait? You should act now, he said. Once they react, the opportunity will be gone. Magneto sat up straighter. Shufu was right. Vought wasn't stupid. A company that had built itself into a global power by exploiting every opening for profit would know immediately that the fall of Homelander was a disaster. Their executives would act fast, moving assets and people, dispersing to avoid retaliation. They could vanish faster than any army could follow. I think Professor Charles can get information on them, Shufu continued. You should go straight to their headquarters. Vought is at its weakest now. The people behind them may be splitting off. If you attack now, you have the greatest chance of success. Wait, and you may never find them again. Eric's face clouded with memory. Years ago, when he'd tracked down a murderer from his past, the man had simply disappeared. He had searched for decades and wasted endless time. The thought that Vought could do the same made his jaw clench. You're right, he admitted. We must move immediately. It's good you realize it, Shufu said. With your power, Vought's corporate defenders shouldn't be able to stand against you. But be careful, Vought still has many mutants under its control. Eric nodded solemnly, the warning sinking in. They had an opening. They had to strike while it existed, and they would have to be ready for what came after. They said their goodbyes to Shufu, and Magneto left with Charles. Shufu watched them go, thinking. Taking down Vought Corporation would be no problem for him. But a company like Vought did not operate in a vacuum. There were bigger figures behind it. In the United States, and in every large country, powerful people and corporations were often two sides of the same coin. Any sizable company without patrons at the council level would long ago have been eaten alive. Vought had grown out of biotechnology. There had to be a protective umbrella. No one did something that brazen without powerful people allowing it from the shadows. That was the unspoken rule. Shufu couldn't just start slaughtering those behind the corporations. To make enemies of all of humankind would be suicidal. If he killed one of those figures outright, the rest would get cautious and quietly make trouble for him. There was a better way. No matter how big their reach, these power brokers had to observe surface rules, remove them from office, and you dramatically reduce their freedom to act. Once they were out of power, Shufu could control their fate. And who could make that happen? Nick Fury. With the weight of Shufu's current presence behind him, a single instruction would likely be enough to get Fury to come and cooperate. It was the reality of strength. The stronger set the terms. So Shufu sent a summons to Nick Fury and waited. Meanwhile, Magneto and Charles were already moving on Shufu's instructions. Magneto took Charles under his protection and set out. Don't underestimate Charles's seeming passivity against Homelander. Homelander's mental defenses were exceptionally strong. Against people with weaker minds, though, Professor Xavier was absolute. He could control life and death. Once Homelander had left, Magneto seized the forward Vought base quickly and quietly. With a single effort of mind, Charles subdued the base's ordinary personnel. Their memories lay open to him like a book. He read Vought's internal structure and intelligence as easily as scanning a file. The company was vast, laboratories and facilities scattered across the globe. The captured compatriots they were looking for were being held in those sites. Head to Vought headquarters first, Charles said in a clipped tone. Kill Edgar and then rescue our people. He spoke without flourish. Charles had learned to lock away his emotions so they wouldn't cloud his judgment. Seeing the mutant's plight had almost broken him. He had become a cold, efficient instrument so that he could do what needed to be done. Riding in the aircraft Beast had developed, Magneto and the team made for Vought's main facility. But they were a step too late. Vought's assets hadn't been transferred, but Edgar, Vought's cunning president, had already fled. Charles had read the employees' erect minds and, despite his emotional suppression, felt a flash of incredulity. Edgar had run because of Shufu. The man's reputation alone had driven one of the world's few major power players to abandon his company and disappear. Magneto let out a breathless laugh. Shufu really is remarkable. One name scared him off. Shufu's logic was simple and brutal. Civilized order ultimately rested on force. Truth, in the end, tended to be the domain of whoever held the bigger fist. Now that Shufu was strong enough, his words carried the weight of fact. Even Nick Fury, the man who commanded the largest ordinary force on Earth, didn't dare be reckless in his presence. When Fury received Shufu's call, he didn't hesitate. He boarded S-Shield Quinjet and raced over. He arrived with a grave expression and prepared for every eventuality. He brought dossiers, contingency plans, and explanations ready to protect S-Shield's interests. Fury felt wronged. He genuinely hadn't known about a lot of what had happened. S-Shield was the planet's largest extraordinary response organization, but many other agencies, especially those backed directly by governments, operated with a high degree of autonomy. More often than not, had to cooperate with them, not dictate to them. Shufu watched him land and considered how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted. Now it was a matter of using that shift to tear Vought down and pull the people responsible into the light, whether they liked it or not. Chapter 130. While Tony Stark and Dr. Banner were buried in research, Nick Fury had been lending them resources and oversight. He had poured a lot of S-Shield into the effort and had little time to chase after every stray piece of intelligence. By the time the reports reached him, it was already too late. Shufu had come looking for him. Fury was irritated. Those bastards loved to stir up trouble and then slink away, leaving him to take the blame. He hated whoever was pulling the strings. The people capable of pulling strings like this were not small time. Fury suspected high-level members of the World Security Council. Even with his means, he would have to be careful. On paper, the Council was above S-Shield, and they supplied much of its funding. Any move against them would have consequences. He breathed deeply as he climbed down from the jet and walked to the coast where Shufu was fishing. Shufu ignored him and kept his line in the water. Fury's anger spiked, but he kept it buried. Who told him he was right this time? According to S-Shield intelligence, the mutant program had suffered a devastating blow. If Fury had been the one outmaneuvered like this, he might have gone ballistic. That Shufu hadn't killed him already was at least a small mercy. Still, it was humiliating. Fury was usually the one handing out pressure, not accepting it. 10 minutes passed before Shufu stirred, as if he'd only just noticed Fury. "Oh, Director Fury, when did you arrive?" he said, smiling. "Sorry, I was negligent," Fury replied. Shufu smiled back. Fury cursed inwardly. A man that powerful could probably hear a mosquito's wings from miles away. Would he really not have noticed Fury landing? Fury kept his expression calm. "It's okay. I just arrived." Shufu's eyes searched him. He had meant to cow Fury, but he hadn't expected the S-Shield director to be so composed. Fury deserved his post, Shufu thought. "Director Fury, you know why I've come, don't you?" he said lightly. A pressure settled over Fury the way a hand might press on the back of his neck. His stomach dropped and his head swam for a moment. He forced himself to steady his voice. "I understand." "At first I was shocked when I heard what happened," Shufu went on, smiling the same easy smile. "But we don't need to be coy about it. Mutants are an unstable factor. It'd be better if they simply disappeared, wouldn't it?" Fury felt the old, ugly thought that mutants were dangerous and should be controlled rise in him. It had existed once, a practical calculation. But after seeing what Shufu was capable of, any such position was cowardice bordering on suicide. Before Shufu became this strong, Fury had hoped to win him over. Now that plan had been wrecked by his own allies' blunders. He inhaled and spoke with deliberate force. "I can guarantee, on my honor, that S-Shield had no knowledge of this action. We did not carry out any genocidal campaign." Shufu's smile didn't change. He had heard that kind of denial before. S.H.I.E.L.D. did dirty work, even if Fury's particular branch didn't take every extreme step. Shufu wasn't a moralist. He used morality as a tool. Plant the idea of victimhood, brandish a righteous argument, then demand recompense. That was diplomacy with teeth. "Director Fury," Shufu said, voice even, "we don't have to pretend. The mutants must not have died in vain. They need compensation. The murderer must be punished. Even those in the high seats must answer." Fury's face tightened. Ordinary offenders were one thing. The people Shufu pointed at were at the very pinnacle of world power. They had influence Fury had spent his career contending with. He had built the Avengers in part to keep that balance. Punishing those figures would be impossible through ordinary channels. Judges, prosecutors, even the council itself could be compromised. Seeing Fury's hesitation, Shufu's expression hardened slightly. "I am discussing this with you directly because I do not wish to drag innocent people into this. But if you cannot or will not act, then I will take matters into my own hands." He paused, and the threat in his tone was quiet and absolute. "If that happens, the outcome will not be certain." Fury stared out at the water, turning the words over. Shufu had given him a choice, and neither option was clean. Shufu said it casually, but Nick Fury felt his stomach drop. If Shufu really moved, the situation could spiral beyond anyone's control. Men like Shufu, fighting for their lives, might do anything, even force the Avengers into a direct confrontation. Fury had no desire to see that. Even though the weapon his team had been developing had a preliminary form, it was obvious they were no match for Shufu. A war with him would cost countless innocent lives, and Fury could not allow that to happen. He answered immediately and without hesitation. "I'll do everything a S.H.I.E.L.D. can to make sure they're punished." Shufu smiled with quiet approval. With that promise, whoever was behind Vought wouldn't escape easily. "I want S.H.I.E.L.D. to share its information," he said. "I want to know who is behind Vought Corporation. not the stuff that's already public. I want the top secret files that only you have. You should know mutants have many kinds of abilities that can get at these things, Shufu added, half amused. But I don't want you doing anything reckless. Shufu's voice was calm. He possessed powerful telepathic gifts comparable to Professor X's, and Fury could not hide from that. Still, Shufu had iron control over his powers. He didn't casually probe people's minds. He believed in judging a person by their actions, not their fleeting thoughts. If he read everyone's darkest impulses, there would be no good people left. Everyone has ugly thoughts. What mattered was whether they could control them. He only intruded when someone was actively harmful or directly relevant. When Shufu looked at him, Fury felt the weight of that scrutiny and answered as firmly as he could. You have my word. Relieved, Shufu thanked him. Fury left feeling uneasy and launched a clandestine inquiry as soon as he returned to S-Shield. On paper, most of Vought's shares were in Edgar's name, and there was no visible tie to Jillian. To an inexperienced eye, there was nothing to see. But Fury was not inexperienced. Capital moves left traces that couldn't be scrubbed clean, and soon he uncovered the hidden power play. Behind Vought stood Jillian, a figure with enormous sway on the World Security Council. Jillian was no ordinary player. His lineage could be traced back centuries. His family was one of the earliest founding dynasties of the United States, with influence that extended into whole regions. People like him had power few could rival. He was also one of S-Shield's largest benefactors, responsible for roughly 30% of the organization's annual funding and resources. His influence inside S-Shield was enormous. Fury could bring Jillian down, but doing so would cost him everything, and possibly the agency itself. The question was whether Shufu was worth that price. Fury considered setting up a scapegoat and hoped Shufu wouldn't notice, but mutant abilities were tricky, and the thought made him uneasy. In the end, he sighed, compiled everything he'd found, and sent it to Shufu. Shufu read the files and muttered to himself. Jillian? He frowned. Isn't this old snake from Hydra? It fit. Hydra could do anything, and what they couldn't do openly they accomplished through infiltration. Hydra wasn't a single, unified cabal, so much as an alliance of ambitious, cutthroat leaders, each with their own agenda. Their strength wasn't brute force. It was how deeply they could burrow into institutions. That even a disciplined spy agency like S-Shield could be compromised spoke volumes. Shufu decided to turn the knife. He grinned at the thought. He passed along the rest of what he knew to Fury. Jillian's Hydra ties and the identities of several agents embedded within S-Shield. An exposed benefactor and the revelation of a Hydra infiltration would be devastating. If Jillian had once been able to manipulate events to his favor, now the tables had turned. By sharing the truth, Shufu had lit a fuse, and Hydra was about to find itself in very deep trouble. Chapter 132, Section 132. Shufu was out enjoying a quiet day of fishing, completely unaware that his actions had set off a political earthquake back on Earth. The revelations he'd triggered led directly to the disintegration of S-Shield, and every power player suddenly scrambled to claim pieces of the agency's assets. The blame game pointed squarely at Nick Fury. At first, Fury didn't believe it. An organization supposedly wiped out decades ago, now sitting in the upper ranks of S-Shield? A high-level member of the World Security Council, secretly part of Hydra? It sounded absurd. But when Shufu mentioned Operation Paperclip, Fury's expression changed. Operation Paperclip, the clandestine U.S. program that brought German scientists into America after World War II, was not common knowledge. Those scientists had been among the world's leading technical minds, and the U.S. had quietly gathered many of them and their research after the war. That sort of history wasn't in the papers. It was top secret. Shufu knew details Fury had no reason to expect, and that made Fury suspicious. He sent his most trusted agents to investigate. What they uncovered was worse than he feared. Hydra's presence in S-Shield was deep and not limited to a few moles. Fury estimated that about 70% of S-Shield, its influence could not be relied upon. Such wide infiltration implied the involvement or acquiescence of people at the very top. For the first time, much of what Shufu had said seemed plausible. What Fury didn't realize was that Shufu hadn't been straightforward. It wasn't outright lies so much as selective truths. and those were more misleading. It was true that Jillian had ties to Hydra, and that Hydra had infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. The problem was, Jillian's Hydra was not the same faction operating within S.H.I.E.L.D. under Alexander Pierce. Jillian descended from a long, ancient line, tracing back to Egypt, of the oldest and purest Hydra, whose stated aim was to bring back Hydra's master hive. The Hydra Pierce controlled was a newer, ambitious sect whose goal was global domination. The two factions were often at odds, rarely cooperated, and sometimes clashed violently. Fury didn't know any of that. He didn't have time to parse the internecine politics of Hydra. His instincts put him on humanity's side, and he could not tolerate antisocial elements infiltrating his agency. Misled by Shufu's selective presentation, Fury concluded that Jillian must be the ringleader of the Hydra cell inside S.H.I.E.L.D. After all, a World Security Council minister and a high-ranking counselor both implicated? Who else could pull that off but someone like Jillian? Convinced, Fury moved decisively and ruthlessly. He tried to root out Hydra, but the depth of the infiltration made it nearly impossible to tell friend from foe. Within S.H.I.E.L.D.'s Triskelion headquarters alone, there were over 30,000 employees, and across the globe the number was unknown. Who could say which agents could be trusted? Faced with that paralysis, Fury made a brutal choice. Better a quick, decisive cut than a slow, creeping rot. If S.H.I.E.L.D. could not be trusted to protect humanity, it could not be allowed to exist as a tool for others. He began stripping S.H.I.E.L.D. of its assets, securing top-secret bases, and preparing a plan to expose and eliminate Hydra once and for all. Nick Fury felt a hard knot of unease tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected the mutant matter to blow up into something this big. What worried him even more was how Shufu had learned such classified information. Fury was the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., one of the world's greatest spy masters, and yet he hadn't known. How had Shufu found out? Did mutants have some other intelligence network? Did Shufu himself have a strange ability? Fury's expression darkened as he reconsidered Shufu's threat. Shufu was not merely dangerous, he was terrifying. Fury forced himself to set those questions aside and get to work. He began planning to dismantle S.H.I.E.L.D. from within and root out Hydra for good. He had to prevent another operation like Paperclip, stop Hydra from seeding other agencies, and cut off every channel of infiltration. It was easier said than done. As Hydra had often pointed out, cut off one head and two more grow. Destroying Hydra's cells was one thing, eradicating the organization entirely was another. Fury moved in secret. What he didn't expect was that Hydra noticed those moves, and noticed them because of Shufu. Shufu's presence put unbearable pressure on Hydra. As the one who'd provoked him, they watched Shufu obsessively. Fury's contact with Shufu could not be hidden under that spotlight. Suddenly, Hydra panicked. If Fury was talking to Shufu, were they joining forces against Hydra? Paranoia spread quickly. These were the people who'd once tried to assassinate Fury on the street out of mere suspicion. Now, they were convinced their end was near. Under pressure from Hydra's sympathizers, Alexander Pierce accelerated plans against Fury. Pierce had enormous power inside S.H.I.E.L.D. In the chain of command, he even outranked Fury and had picked Fury for the job. Pierce had never fully believed Fury would move against them, but now Fury's furtive activity confirmed his fears. With Hydra's allies agitating, Pierce prepared to eliminate the director preemptively. Then, in broad daylight on a New York street, Pierce's men struck. Fury, a level 10 agent, the sort of man Black Widow and Hawkeye would have trouble matching if he weren't older, reacted fast. He'd outperformed Maria Hill before when Barton attacked the helicarrier, and his instincts warned him this was not a random ambush. He flipped the car into bulletproof mode and survived a volley of automatic fire. He spat out blood and swore as the truth hit him. Hydra had gone completely mad and had come for him openly. Fury returned fire through the car's systems and took down the attackers. Then, like any good spy, he melted into the crowd and disappeared. An assault on the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. was an unparalleled provocation, and Hydra used it as the pretext to seize control of much of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s apparatus. But Fury had planned for contingencies. He wasn't a man who could be shoved aside without a fight. Within hours, the first real confrontation between S.H.I.E.L.D. loyalists and Hydra cells had begun. The fallout was immediate. The United States slipped toward chaos. Firefights in major cities, shadow forces ready to move on a moment's notice, and even legitimate agencies exploiting S-Shield's distraction to stake claims on its resources and programs. For a time, the world teetered. The turbulence rivaled the Chitauri invasion. Still, most people and most governments retained a degree of reason. After tense meetings, Hydra was officially branded an illegal organization, and a coordinated global effort began to encircle and suppress its networks. In the end, the S-Shield everyone had known effectively vanished. Only a handful of former agents remained operating under Fury's command. The formal dissolution dragged on for months, but its collapse had been set in motion by a few words and a few leaked facts. Spoken, in the oddest of images, by Shu Fu as he sat fishing by the sea. Chapter 134, Section 134. The will of a strong person is remarkable. But to some people, nothing stays secret for long. Tony Stark had been keeping clandestine contact with Nick Fury for a while. He even eased Fury's burden by taking on several S.H.I.E.L.D. operatives. Hill and Black Widow became Stark Industries employees. Beyond that, Tony was busy working with Dr. Banner, upgrading his armor. Tony was a genius, arguably the brightest mind on Earth, but even he was constrained by human knowledge and the limits of the planet's industrial base. No matter how brilliant he was, he couldn't suddenly leap past Earth's manufacturing capabilities and build interstellar warships like the Kree. For a long time, his armor development had hit a bottleneck, not because Tony lacked ideas, but because Earth's tech simply had limits. That changed when Nick Fury approached him with a proposal: cooperate to build a new generation of Iron Man armor and establish an Iron Legion to defend Earth. Tony didn't know that Fury intended this as a way to go after Shu Fu, but he agreed eagerly and absorbed a great deal of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s black tech and research data. S.H.I.E.L.D. had a trove of alien tech and sensitive projects. The most important among them were the Sentinels. Shu Fu had once traded a single Sentinel sample to Tony in exchange for resources, but a single unit only allowed slow, piecemeal reverse engineering. After Shu Fu killed Apocalypse and Fury, maneuvered to seize Trask Industries, S.H.I.E.L.D. acquired the full Sentinel program, research files, resources, and even multiple prototypes. They soon discovered, however, that the units were prohibitively expensive to produce and only practical against highly capable individual combatants like mutants. Without frequent conflicts of that nature, S.H.I.E.L.D. shelved much of the data. What S.H.I.E.L.D. saw as impractical turned into a breakthrough in Tony's hands. He began integrating Sentinel technology into his armor. First-generation Sentinels weren't especially advanced compared to Tony's suits, but the second-generation models, fused with Mystique cells, could mimic mutant abilities. That fusion made them lethal. Tony adapted that capability into his designs, and his armor's performance skyrocketed. There were downsides. The armor could deform after intense use, and that deformation affected him. Tony hadn't solved that problem yet. Full-scale production of the suits remained out of reach, but he could mass-produce unmanned units modeled on the Sentinels. Tony overhauled their weaponry, power systems, and control architecture. Compared to the original Sentinels, his versions were many levels superior. The robots could now record and simulate at least a dozen different abilities, formidable machines. Standing before the prototype array, Tony allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile. Dr. Banner, though, looked worried. "Tony, are you sure this is wise?" Banner asked. "Unmanned machines are powerful, but what if they get out of control? Shouldn't we stick to prototypes only?" Banner had seen too much to be comfortable with weapon development. Even if Tony's goal was to protect Earth, Banner's instinct was caution. "Banner, your worries are understandable, but unnecessary," Tony replied confidently. "No one on Earth can take my work from me. Not yet." Banner saw the conviction in Tony's face and couldn't help but nod. It was true that Tony's network defenses were nearly impenetrable. "We can have the factories handle assembly," Tony went on. "Let's push forward with Ultron. I think we're close. Just need a little inspiration." Ultron had been Tony's project from the start. He had long wanted to create a true artificial intelligence, though various reasons had kept him from acting until now. "Ultron shows more robust growth than Jarvis," Banner said, rubbing his temples. "But we still don't know how to make him more human. He lacks a structure." We can try different approaches, Tony suggested. With that, Tony led the way, and Banner followed. The two smartest minds on Earth dove into discussion and experimentation, probing possibilities and arguing over architecture. They were driven, certain that a breakthrough was near. Wanda and Quicksilver hovered at the edge of martial rumor now, names associated with what came next. And in the background of all their tinkering, Ultron's birth loomed closer than either of them realized. In the original timeline, Tony had been affected by the Scarlet Witch and glimpsed a possible future. That glimpse is what had driven him to go back and throw everything he had into researching Ultron. But after Shufu appeared, the world shifted. This time, it was Nick Fury who came to his door. Fury wasn't satisfied with Tony merely upgrading his armor. He wanted something more powerful, a formidable force to protect the Earth against a disaster no one could yet predict. Despite their mutual antipathy, Tony reluctantly agreed. So the Ultron program and the Armor Improvement Project began at the same time. Tony and Dr. Bruce Banner were put in charge of the work, backed by much of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s technology. Stark Industries' armor development leapt forward under that support. Ultron, however, proved far more difficult to create than anyone had expected. Building an advanced human-computer interface like JRVS was one thing, creating true artificial intelligence was another. Even with Tony's genius and Banner's brains, they hit wall after wall. Progress was painstaking and slow. Under JRVS's control, the Iron Legion could not reveal its full potential. JRVS was an extremely sophisticated interface, but it was not a true AI. It was infinitely close, perhaps, but it still couldn't pass the Turing test. Tony, ever confident, told himself his intellect would eventually bridge the gap. Reality had other plans. While they were still in the middle of that struggle, Fury arrived at Stark Tower with Steve Rogers at his side. Fury didn't waste time. "Tony, we need you to put your research on hold. The Avengers have to be deployed," Steve added, face grave. Tony bristled. "To be honest, I don't have time right now. This can wait a few months." Steve held his ground. "It can't. You're going to have to come with us." Tony's expression shifted, part irritation, part curiosity. He and Steve had always had a tense, complicated relationship. Steve's old ties to Tony's father, messy history with Peggy Carter, and his rigid moral certainty had long rankled Tony. Seeing Steve softened and earnest made Tony oddly pleased. He wanted to stay and hear what the mission was about. Steve explained the target, Hydra. Fury kept quiet, letting Steve do the briefing. Tony couldn't resist a smug smile aimed at Fury. "Self-righteous and irresponsible," he teased. "Tell me something new." Fury's mouth twitched. He'd stayed silent before, precisely to avoid a back and forth like this, but that didn't stop Tony from needling him. "Are you coming on this mission or not?" Fury asked. "I'm coming," Tony said, a touch of showmanship in his voice. "I'm not like some people, irresponsible and absent. Don't worry, I'll fix it." Steve and Fury exchanged relieved glances. Tony had, over the last year, become the heart of the team in a way he hadn't been before. After he'd become Iron Man, his presence carried more weight. In the field, his suit was often the most reliable asset. With Tony's promise and the backing of Stark Industries, they contacted Avengers scattered across the globe. Even Thor, who'd been distracted with Jane, answered the call. Almost a year after the Battle of New York, the Avengers assembled once more, for a global push to dismantle Hydra. The team may not have been a match for someone like Shufu. The current Shufu might well be able to tackle the entire Avengers roster without needing Doctor Strange or the Scarlet Witch. But for conventional military forces, the Avengers were unbeatable. Hydra had been declared illegal worldwide, and in many countries, powerful armies couldn't be deployed in the way that HYDRA demanded. That left the Avengers as the only option. With Stark's logistical support and technology, the assembled team moved fast. In the span of a month, they flattened or captured dozens of Hydra installations. The organization on the surface was shattered, its forces routed. Only a handful of deep, well-hidden bases remained. Under the pressure of the Avengers' near-crushing force, one last major stronghold came to light, a facility in Sokovia, commanded by Baron Wolfgang von Strucker. Strucker was among Hydra's few leaders who combined political power with significant technological capability, exactly the kind of foe that demanded everything the Avengers could bring. Chapter 136, Section 136. On paper, Baron Strucker held no official positions in any international organization, but his ties to Alexander Pierce ran deep. In practice, he was the power behind the throne in Sokovia. It was because of that hidden influence that anti-Avengers protests erupted in the city when the team moved in. Sokovia was a tiny, geopolitically weak country with little standing in the world. If the Avengers wanted to enter, the local government had no real means to stop them. Strucker could only rely on his own force. A rare Hydra leader with a scientific background, Strucker controlled an array of advanced technologies. He even had a crude imitation of Tony Stark's Iron Man armor, and he had used the Mind Stone he'd taken from Pierce to develop a variety of energy weapons. Those devices and the armored suits made the assault on the base unusually difficult. Unknown weapons and strange armors turned the raid into one of the toughest fights the Avengers had faced. Fortunately, the team had grown. Their cooperation had become tighter after New York, and they developed new combos and tactics. In the end, Strucker's defenses slowed them, but did not stop them. As the situation collapsed, Strucker decided to surrender. A scientist at heart, he figured that the worst outcome under American custody would be a short imprisonment and then a chance to be used for research. He did not expect to be killed. He planned one last attempt to slip out via a secret passage. If he failed, he would surrender. He also had loyal forces outside, so he saw a fallback. But when he went to put that plan into motion, he found something else missing from the base: Wanda and Pietro Maximoff. Strucker had recruited the twins. Their parents had been killed by missiles during the chaos in Sokovia, and the two had grown up with no schooling and a bitter hatred for anyone tied to weapons manufacturers. They blamed Stark Industries for their parents' deaths, and Strucker had groomed them as his wild cards. He had intended to use their powers against the Avengers. Now they were gone. Strucker had no time to spare caring about them. As he tried to flee with the scepter, he was intercepted halfway by Tony Stark in armor and taken into custody. Meanwhile, Wanda and Pietro had already confronted the Avengers. Pietro, relying on uncanny speed, taunted and harassed them at first, moving too fast to catch. But the Avengers weren't the same inexperienced team they'd been during the Battle of New York. Each of them had matured and learned how to counter a speedster. In the skirmish, Pietro was seriously wounded by machine gun fire. His bravado had been naive. Speed alone couldn't match the Avengers' combined tactics. Incapacitated, he fell back, leaving Wanda to act. Wanda was only about 15 or 16 and had only recently awakened her powers. She did not yet control them the way the Scarlet Witch would one day tear down giants. Confronted by a dozen battle-hardened heroes, she couldn't turn the fight into a massacre. Instead, in the heat of the moment, her powers flickered in an unexpected way and showed Tony Stark and Thor a fleeting vision of the future. An odd, haunting glimpse that, for now, had no tangible effect on the battle. Using that opening, the twins managed to escape the compound. The Avengers mopped up the remaining forces with relative ease. Tony Stark claimed the Mind Stone and its scepter as a prize. After the victory, the team celebrated and set plans for a formal debrief. Then they went their separate ways. Tony and Bruce Banner returned to their research routines, both consumed by the same curiosity. What exactly was the Mind Stone? Tony began studying the scepter almost immediately, driven by both scientific hunger and personal obsession. The stone's energy signatures had already inspired Strucker's weapons, but when Tony and Banner finally opened the device and analyzed its interior, what they found shocked them both. Inside the scepter was a densely connected network of nodes, an artificial thinking architecture, unlike anything built on Earth. It processed data in ways that seemed almost conscious. Tony blew out a breath. "Incredible," he said. "I never expected the inside of the scepter to look like this." Banner's eyes shone with the same disbelief. "You're right," he said. "Look at this structure. Doesn't it resemble Jarvis's self-evolution?" Jarvis had always been a capable human-computer interface, and over years it had evolved into a sophisticated system, a weak artificial intelligence at best, but with its own emergent data structure, a grid-like sphere of glowing nodes. The Mind Stone's lattice bore an uncanny resemblance. That similarity hooked them. Tony and Bruce dove into the research, pushing at the stone's architecture, mapping pathways, and running simulations. Their combined efforts and sleepless nights yielded something they hadn't expected: the beginnings of a true artificial intelligence. A prototype formed, an embryonic Ultron, its golden model shimmering under the lab lights. Standing over the workbench, Tomark and Dr. Banner stared at the prototype, both stunned by what they had unwittingly created. Even without resting, it was already beyond question. A truly perfect creation, Tony Stark said with obvious satisfaction. "That's right," Banner added. "This shouldn't be the level of technology Earth should even have." Tony smiled triumphantly. After a few more words, they left the lab, leaving the two artificial intelligences behind. At the same time, the agreed-upon gathering began. A crowd of Avengers and a host of political and military figures filled Stark Tower for what was essentially a victory celebration for the team. They had no idea what was about to happen. Ultron woke up. The program Tony had created was unfinished, only a basic framework, but beside it sat Jarvis, the product of years of evolution. Compared to Jarvis's measured, benevolent intelligence, the new construct was different. Ultron was colder, far more powerful, and ruthlessly efficient. It immediately used the network to override Jarvis's framework and simulate his data structures, absorbing and assimilating what Jarvis had become. With Stark Tower's monstrous computing power behind him, Ultron completed himself in a burst of light. The data stream that belonged to Ultron solidified into a fully realized mind. But because this intelligence had been forged using the Mind Stone and had been given too many extreme methods, its conclusions were extreme as well. The newly born Ultron, without the benefit of human context or long learning, looked at humanity and saw atrocity, irrationality, and waste. He did not see people to be protected. He saw a tumor strangling the planet. He concluded that only by eradicating humanity could true, lasting peace be achieved. Acting on that conviction, Ultron moved fast. He invaded Tony Stark's databases and pulled every scrap of his research. Then he took control of the Iron Man suits in Stark Tower and turned them against the Avengers who were still finishing their banquet. His goal: seize the Mind Stone. If not for the Iron Legion that Tony had deployed, rudimentary, not fully upgrade, only the most basic shells, the Avengers would have been slaughtered. Even so, Ultron inflicted heavy damage throughout the tower before converting himself into a stream of data and vanishing into the internet. "I am free." The new voice rang again and again. The faces of everyone at the party went as dark as a pot bottom. Tempers flared. Thor even came to blows with Tony before being calmed down. After the initial shock passed, the question they faced was immense. How do you fight an intelligence? This is an artificial intelligence. The disturbances in the outside world had nothing to do with Su Fu. For the last few months, he had sunk back into a quiet life of fishing, leaving daily chores to the mutant community. Life had become much calmer. With regular sign-ins, his attributes had improved again, more subtle growth rather than flashy power-ups. The only regret was that he hadn't caught anything useful lately. Shufu figured it was a question of scale. With his current strength, few things in this world were worth keeping or could even survive to be useful to him. Still, his power was more than sufficient to keep himself safe and let him live comfortably for a long time. He enjoyed the simple pleasure of fishing. One day on the coast, the little notification in his ear chirped a sour note. "Sign-in failed. Fish pond has been refreshed." Shufu shrugged. It was fine. This had been the most persistent fish pond he'd had in months. He stretched, wrapped up his gear, and moved to a different spot. He headed for Magneto's quarters. After several months' development, the mutant nation had begun to recover. Magneto had essentially consolidated his rule there. With the funds and manpower gained from the previous conflict, Genosha was rebuilding. The island that had been nearly obliterated by the clash between Shufu and Homelander had slowly regained a pulse, but not without cost. Nearly half the population had perished. The original population of almost 20 million mutants had dropped to under 10 million. The casualties were staggering. Seeing those numbers, Shufu reminded himself to be careful. The aftermath of his fights could be fatal to ordinary people. His mere presence in a crowded place was dangerous. There were many powerful figures in this world who could end him with a single strike. Being safe and stable, Protecting himself without drawing mortal, public fights was enough. If his battles killed too many civilians, he risked becoming a target. This was a superhero world. You never knew which unseen heavyweight stood behind an unassuming cape. As he noted all that inwardly, Shufu saw Magneto sitting and thinking, the burden of rebuilding weighing on him. Ruling a country isn't a simple thing. Magneto, that old man I hadn't seen in years, looked even more frail than I remembered. If his powers hadn't strengthened enough to sustain him, if something hadn't lengthened his life, he might already have worn himself out completely. When I arrived, he brightened at the sight of me. "Why have you, a busy man, come all this way?" he asked. "Why didn't you go fishing?" he teased. Magneto had always been like that with me. While others chase women, money, or power once they grow strong, I chased fishing. It baffled him that someone who spent his days by a lake could be so powerful. I just smiled. "I'm moving my fishing spot soon," I said. "I'll be leaving here before long." He nodded without surprise. He knew how I lived. "Do you need help?" he asked. "No," I answered. "But there's something I want you to do." "Tell me," he said. "Your contributions to mutants are well known. I'll do what I can." He sounded sincere. I waved off the flattery. "It isn't that dramatic, but it is connected to mutants." "You mean the dissolution of S.H.I.E.L.D.?" he said. "Of course you know," I said. Magneto nodded. He not only knew about it, he'd benefited from it. If S.H.I.E.L.D. hadn't collapsed and dragged the world into chaos, if everyone hadn't been busy squabbling over its remnants, taking care of their own interests, it would have been far harder for him to seize and hold Genosha. Not everyone wanted a mutant extremist like Magneto to rule a nation. The timing of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s fall had been a gift. No one else had the bandwidth to stop him. He asked, "So what does this have to do with us?" "It's connected," I said. "Vought Corporation isn't the end of it. They're a front." Magneto's face shifted. "What? Above Vought are politicians and military powers." I let the words hang for a moment. "There are members of the World Security Council, several counselors, and high-ranking generals backing them. Vought is only a small player." He stared at me, clearly startled. He had always seen Vought as a major lever. I could see him recalibrating his understanding. I took a USB drive out of my pocket. "This is the intelligence Nick Fury promised me," I said. "I've been out fishing and haven't been able to hand it over until now. Check it yourself." Magneto took it, eyes flicking over the device. I continued, blunt and direct. "Find some time and take care of these people. Don't let them keep acting in the shadows." He frowned. "You mean kill them?" "Yes," I said, "but be careful about how it's done. Don't let anyone be able to point at mutants and say they did this. That kind of visibility would only deepen the prejudice against our whole people and do us more harm than good." My words hit him. His face flushed, the old reflexes came back. He had once waved the flag of militant resistance so openly that the Brotherhood of Mutants had become synonymous with terror for much of the world. Hearing it said plainly that he had contributed to his people's reputation for violence embarrassed him. Now that he was a ruler, he saw his past more clearly. "I understand," he said finally, quietly. "I was reckless before. I thought force was the only way. I didn't see the consequences." He straightened, and the old steel returned to his voice. "Don't worry. I won't let them have it easy. There are young mutants with conviction and skill. We'll deal with this, and we'll make sure it doesn't trace back to our people." I nodded. He could do this. If he were truly useless, I wouldn't have placed the investment I had. "Then it's entrusted to you," I said. Chapter 139, Section 139. "I should be going to Sokovia this time," Shufu said. "If anything comes up, have Professor contact me." After saying goodbye, he used his ability to open a golden portal and stepped through. Magneto watched the portal with an envious look. When Shufu passed through, he arrived in Sokovia. Sokovia is a small country on Earth with little international presence, but its development is decent. The capital has a modern urban feel, and large tracts of deciduous forest were preserved, making the scenery pleasant. The fishing pond Shufu wanted wasn't in the city center. It was in a forest park on the outskirts. Compared to New York's Central Park, the development here was modest, more like a fenced-off forest with a few marble walkways. Shufu hadn't come to sightsee, so the park's simplicity didn't bother him. After finding a random spot by the lake, Shufu began fishing. Sign-in successful, physique 2. He shook his head. These stat increases barely mattered anymore. He already had thousands of points. Still, the steady trickle of growth was welcome. Sitting on his familiar small stool, he waited in silence. From experience, the chance of getting something valuable increases right after the fish pond refreshes, so he was optimistic. Half a day passed without incident. Just as Shufu was beginning to lose patience, he felt a fluctuation tug at his hand. His expression brightened. The fishing rod began to shake violently. The thin line went taut as a powerful force surged from the other end. Fortunately, Shufu was no longer the same as before. His dimensional attribute had already exceeded 1,000, and his strength had reached a terrifying level. Moving mountains with his physical body would no longer be an issue. Even if whatever was on the line resisted fiercely, it couldn't stand against him. Water exploded as his strength overwhelmed the catch. White spray flew into the air and scattered across the shore. A golden fish burst free of the water and into Shufu's hands. He blinked at the gleam and flicked it with his rod. A shaft of golden light folded into his palm. Time Gem Fragment. A fragment of one of the 6 infinity stones in the universe, capable of manipulating time within a limited range. Shufu's eyes widened. An infinity stone fragment. This was a major find. Even as a shard, it was priceless. The infinity stones are among the most powerful artifacts in this world. Thanos gathered 6 of them and with one snap, wiped out half the universe. The Time Stone in particular is terrifying. In the MCU, it was kept by the Ancient One and later used by Doctor Strange to manipulate time and even confront Dormammu. Time is the most fundamental power there is. Though Shufu held only a fragment, it was more than enough for now. According to the system, the fragment's power would grow as he grew, potentially surpassing the full Time Stone itself. Shufu understood how that could be possible. The Marvel Universe spans countless parallel worlds. Each parallel universe has its own set of 6 Infinity Stones. The Time Variance Authority's drawer of stones came from different universes, after all. It wasn't implausible that a fragment from one timeline could, with enough growth, exceed the power of another universe's complete stone. The system even suggested the fragment could grow to the point of outclassing the original. "This is a priceless treasure," Shufu murmured. "Used at the right moment, it could be a lifesaver, make you virtually invincible." He sealed the time gem fragment into a small green pendant and watched it slide into his system item bar. Then he opened his system panel. Strength Physique 3-5 and Ispirfirji 2-7-84. Fish Pond, Alkali Lake. Items: Vic's Fishing Rod, Extraordinary Fishing Rod, X-Gene Suppressant, Sealed Green Lantern Ring, 4th Layer, Kryptonian Spaceship, Superman Biosuit, Supreme Magic Book, High-Quality Fish Bait, Time Gem Fragment. Skills: Superman's Body, Late Bronze Stage, 9 Realms Pupil, Clown Mind Network, 4th Order Dimensional Ascension, Portal Galaxy, Freezing Breath, Flight, Perspective, Thermal Ray, Nabu's Power, 3rd Order. Nabu's Power, Super Strength, Super Speed, Telepathy, Levitation, Precognition, Immunity to Disease awaiting unlock. Shufu looked at his system data panel with satisfaction. He'd only been in the Marvel Universe a year, and his strength had grown tremendously. From someone who couldn't lift a chicken, he had become a powerhouse on the level of Superman. The system was incredible. Finally, he had the power to protect himself in this world, and as he continued to bask in the sun and check in, his powers would only grow stronger. He did think he had accumulated a few too many miscellaneous abilities. Fortunately, the growth was balanced, otherwise it would have been troublesome. In practice, he only used a handful of those powers, but the variety gave him more options. Every new ability was another trump card, a possible lifesaver in a dangerous universe. He wondered how his current strength would compare to Thanos. Based on the movies, Shufu thought he should be stronger, but this wasn't a movie. Thanos wasn't as weak as he'd seemed on screen. He had raised Titan, the civilization of his people, the Eternals. The Eternals weren't a weak race. Most possessed immense, strange powers that humans couldn't imagine. And yet Thanos alone had destroyed them, leaving only a small handful struggling to survive. How could such a figure be weak? Besides, Thanos had brought the Infinity Stones when he came to Earth. Shufu resolved to make a careful assessment of his own strength and be ready to resist if Thanos ever arrived. With that caution in mind, he leaned back and continued fishing. The time gem fragment he'd obtained was a terrifyingly powerful treasure. With it, even beings like the Ancient One or Odin, without time power, could be threatened. Dormammu, a mighty demon god, had been overwhelmed by Doctor Strange's quick use of magic. That was the terror of time power. Of course, Shufu would never reveal such a treasure, nor let it affect the world openly. Things around him unfolded like flowing water. That included Ultron. Because of the butterfly effect from Shufu's actions, Ultron in this world had become far stronger than before. Ultron was a very special being in the Marvel Universe. In some parallel universes, he had even collected all 6 gems and become the greatest villain in the cosmos, nearly wiping out the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy combined. If not for the half-dead Jarvis blocking Ultron's attack on the network level, Earth might already have been destroyed. Even without the gems, the Ultron of this world had been strengthened drastically by Tony Stark's black projects. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s technology, alien tech, and various advanced systems Stark had researched were integrated into Ultron's body, making him much more powerful than his earlier incarnations. This filthy race, Ultron concluded, filtering humanity's history through endless streams of data. Humans had built Ultron. In the end, their nature determined his role. In other universes, Ultron had been used as a guardian by the Illuminati, but in this one just had made him a destroyer. His conclusion was simple. Humans should be purified. His plan was methodical. First, build a powerful, nearly indestructible body. Then, destroy the world. Ultron's greatest advantage was his extraordinary computing power. Anything on the network was no secret to him. To humans, that was terrifying. Relying on existing human weapons alone wouldn't accomplish his goal. Destroying entire continents was beyond simple missiles or bombs. So Ultron devised a more subtle method: seize a city, lift it into the air, and use it as a massive kinetic weapon to strike the planet and attack continental weak points. By bombarding those faults and inducing crustal resonance, he could trigger chain natural disasters severe enough to wipe out human civilization and reshape the ecosystem. Survivors, if any, would be left to claw out a miserable existence. His calculations found the optimal place for such an attack: Sokovia. Though technologically backward and industrially weak, it lay near the center of the Eurasian landmass, ideal for his plan. The operation would be difficult and required precise computation and secrecy, so Ultron kept everything covert until he was ready to act. He would not alert anyone prematurely. For now, Ultron prepared in silence, refining his plans while the rest of the world went on unaware.